2. The Missing Hour. It was not until October, nearly a month after I received her initial letter, that I actually met Kathie Davis face to face. It was an odd, sweet, and emotional occasion that will be told in a later chapter, but I would like to describe her here, nevertheless. Though she is of medium height, she is a large, broad-shouldered, big-boned woman, and despite the various illnesses she has suffered, her body is a strong one. Her kind, intelligent face is surrounded by short, curly, dark blonde hair. After I had been with her a while, I noticed that her hazel eyes vary slightly in hue, one from the other, a feature which helps explain why her glance is so subtly arresting. Kathie is a careful observer, but her attitude towards the strange events she has experienced is tinged with irony and a sense of resignation. During a 3-year period of our investigation, I saw Kathie undergo rather pronounced changes. When we met, she was an unemployed and recently divorced woman with 2 small children living at home with her parents. As the investigation progressed and she began to understand more about the cause of her deep-seated anxiety, she began to gain self-confidence. Eventually, she went back to school and trained for a new career. She now has her own apartment and is self-supporting. Her old anxiety is still there, but its effects are no longer crippling. Though Kathie's education was obviously less than Ivy League, her intelligence and range of information are self-evident. Her conversational style can be salty and only casually grammatical, but one discovers that she is highly sophisticated in surprising ways. She has considerable talent as a visual artist, as several illustrations in this book demonstrate, but I discovered that she has another quality which I respect whenever I sense its presence, a particular kind of insight into others, an ability to read and understand people, not in a mystical way, but with simple, practical, intuitive awareness. The German word is apt. Kathie is a true Menschenkenner, a knower of men. If I were to go to a party and meet new people or visit old acquaintances, I would include her on a very short list of those friends whose opinions I would solicit immediately after leaving. What did you think of him? How do you read her? Is he possibly more intelligent than he seems? Her gifts in this area are rarer than one supposes and very much to be cherished. Kathie's initial letter had presented only a general outline of the events leading up to the appearance of the strange lights and desiccated soil in the Davises' backyard. When I first read it, I had no reason to think that this apparent UFO incident could possibly have involved an abduction, and so our investigation focused on other issues. But after 2 visits to Indianapolis and many wide-ranging interviews with Kathie, her family, and neighbors, I gradually came to realize that the sequence of remembered events just did not cohere. No matter how we looked at it, there was at least an hour missing from Kathie's recollection of that night. What finally emerged after extensive investigation is on the basis of its compelling physical evidence alone, one of the most important UFO abduction cases on record. It began very casually on a summer day like any other, June 30th, 1983, was hot and muggy in the Indianapolis environs. the temperature reached 85 degrees. Though the skies were somewhat overcast, shortly before dinner time, Kathie set off to attend her regular Thursday evening therapy group, a program she had joined to help her cope with years of insomnia and paralyzing anxiety. She returned home at the usual time, around 7:15 p.m., ate her supper, and then put her boys, Robbie and Tommy, to bed. After dinner, she called her friend Deanne to arrange an evening of sewing at Deanne's house. The two women shared a modest business venture together, making clothes to order for friends. The first peculiar observation was made a little before 9 o'clock, as Kathie was telling her mother her plans for the evening. She glanced out the kitchen window and noticed a light shining from the little pump house near their swimming pool. Though I was aware of some of these details from her original letter, subsequent personal interviews provided a great deal of new information. I learned, for example, that there was something odd about the color of the illumination in the pool house. The door was open and there was a funny colored light glowing from inside. A white light, more like a fluorescent light than the yellowish bulb we had there. I asked my mom to look at it. I told her that I had just been out there and I remember the door was closed. Mom said not to worry about it. It was nothing, and just passed it off. But I had a really strange feeling when I saw it. It was kind of eerie. A few minutes later, when Kathie left to visit Deanne, things had changed. Now the pump house was dark, and the door was closed. But the garage door, which had been shut, was open. The trip to her friend's house is only a 5-minute drive, so when Kathie arrived about 9:15, she called her mother immediately and told her about the garage door, asking if she wanted her to come home and search the property for a possible intruder. Kathie knew that her father would not be back from work for at least 2 hours, and that in the meantime her mother would be alone with Kathie's 2 little children. Nevertheless, Mary declined her daughter's offer, saying that everything seemed all right at home and she shouldn't bother. A moment later, however, as Mary stood at the kitchen sink, she noticed a strange round ball of light surrounding the bird feeder in the backyard. This small feeder, sitting atop a 4-foot pole, is located about 12 feet from the kitchen window. Mary described what she saw this way. It was a pale white light. It wasn't real bright. I could see the bird feeder through it. And I thought, gee, where's that light coming from? I leaned out to see if a car was coming. And then I thought, that's impossible. No car could shine its lights over behind the house. And there wasn't any beam. It was just there. It was round and it's about as big as a basketball. But I could see the bird feeder through it. Then it just sort of faded out, all at once. And so, only a few moments after she had talked to Kathie, she called her back and said that perhaps after all, she should come home and look around. Kathie, sensing a slight uneasiness in her mother's usually reassuring tone of voice, left immediately. The time sequence now becomes particularly important. Most crucial are the hour Kathie arrived back home and the approximate time she left to return to Deanne's. Fortunately, we can estimate both with near certainty. Deanne's 11-year-old daughter Tammy had been out shopping with her grandmother that night. The store closed at 9 p.m. And Tammy remembers that they arrived back at her mother's sometime before 9:30 and that Kathie had already left. Both Kathie and her mother recall that Kathie arrived at home around 9:30. She went straight to the closet and took out her father's rifle to provide herself a little spiritual edge over any possible intruders. Her mother reminded her that the rifle was unloaded, but Kathie replied that that was all right. She'd take it anyway. Mary chuckled and said, "What are you going to do with it? Beat him to death?" Undaunted but nervous, Kathie went outside to search for prowlers. She and Mary both recalled that she seemed to be gone no more than 10 minutes. When she returned to the kitchen, she told her mother that everything appeared to be normal and that she was now going back to Deanne's, not to sew, but to get Deanne to come back with her for a moonlight swim since it was such a hot night. If she had been outside only for the 10 minutes she remembered, she should have arrived at Deanne's sometime between 9:45 and 10. In fact, she arrived about 11 p.m. and probably a little after. There's a period of at least an hour of missing time. Both Tammy and Deanne recall that Kathie came very late, suggesting they all go for a swim. It seemed like a good idea, so they quickly put on bathing suits. Kathie borrowed one of Deanne's, but Tammy, for some reason, decided to change when they got to the pool. They remained at Deanne's no more than 15 or 20 minutes before returning to the Davises, where they discovered that Kathie's father had just come home from work. Robert Davis worked a late shift and never arrived home before 11:30. And that night, everyone remembers, was no exception. Kathie, Deanne, and Tammy arrived then sometime after 11:30, having spent by all accounts no more than 25 minutes changing clothes at Deanne's and driving over for their swim. Kathie had somehow lost the hour between 10 and 11 o'clock. But more strange things were about to occur. As they headed towards the pool, Tammy, barefoot, decided to walk on the grass to the left of her mother and Kathie, both of whom kept to the gravel path. At some point in the yard, she stepped on a place where there wasn't any grass, and it felt warm, like warm cement, as she told me later. My foot felt tingly and kind of numb. Having brought her bathing suit with her, Tammy went into the little pump house to change. As she did so, she began to feel nauseated and dizzy. When she came out and joined the others in the pool, something did not feel right. Deanne said that from the moment she arrived in the backyard, she felt uneasy, like somebody's watching us. It was a very distinct feeling, though when she mentioned it, Kathie tried to downplay it. I'm out here all the time swimming by myself, Kathie said. It doesn't bother me. But she described other problems that arose. So we were swimming around and I dunked my hair back and got it wet, though I didn't get my face under the water. And Deanne looked at me and I looked at her, and all of a sudden we're both freezing, though it's about 80 degrees out. It was a really warm night. She asked Tammy if she was cold, and she said she was, so we decided to get out. We'd only been in a few minutes, too, but I was having trouble with my eyes. Everything was starting to look real hazy. I was the first to dry off because I couldn't see very good, and the longer I sat there, the more I couldn't see. Everything was sort of white, and I hadn't even gotten my eyes under the water, for the chlorine to do that. Everything was white with halos around the lights. It was weird, and I kept rubbing my eyes and they started burning. I went to the eye doctor 2 days after that, and he said I had something like conjunctivitis in both eyes. I had a lot of trouble with them. There was even some pus. It was really nasty. The 3 swimmers had yet another problem. They began nearly simultaneously to feel quite nauseated. In Tammy's case, it was a deepening of the condition that had begun when she first entered the pool house. Though it may appear an odd reaction to this kind of illness, they all three decided that what they needed was to eat something. They put shirts and shorts or jeans over their damp bathing suits, borrowed some money from Kathie's father, and headed for a local fast food restaurant that they knew would be open late. When they arrived, their nausea had become worse, so instead of ordering any food, they simply turned around and headed home. All of them considered it peculiar that it had happened so quickly and so similarly to all three, and that Kathie's eye problem had also surfaced so suddenly. Tammy and her mother had both had their heads underwater, but neither suffered any difficulties with their vision. As Kathie said, it was just weird. I remember being so cold. We were shivering, and Tammy's lips were blue. It was so foggy, and we were freezing, and it was the middle of summer, and then we all began to feel really sick. Joyce and Bernie Lloyd, as I shall call them, are the closest neighbors to the north of the Davises. On this same evening, June 30th, Bernie left after dinner on an errand with his son. Note: Bernie's son was his by an earlier marriage. He was taking the boy back to his mother's after a visit of a few days. Joyce was dusting and tidying in the dining room and glancing occasionally at the TV set in the living room. There was a sudden flash outside in the direction of the Davises' backyard, behind the trees that separate the two houses, and then a low, vibrating sound. Joyce felt her house begin to shake. The chandelier in the dining room moved slightly, and as the noise increased, the television picture turned completely red, and all the lights in the house dimmed and flickered. Then everything returned to normal. The sound ended as mysteriously as it had begun. Joyce sat back in her chair, stunned, confused, thinking immediately that there had been a small earthquake. Her next thought was that she should call the Davises and see if they were all right. Perhaps their house had been struck by lightning. Maybe that was the flash she had seen through the trees. But she told me much later that when she thought about calling them, it was as if she simply couldn't do it. Something was preventing her from such a simple, normal act. The time, she noticed, was 10:45 p.m. Bernie came home shortly afterwards. He is a very skeptical man when the subject of UFOs is mentioned, and by the time I interviewed him, months had passed since the incident in the Davises' backyard. He knew, of course, what we suspected, and he had seen the burned circle and swath in the Davises' grass. In this context, I asked him what was going on in the house when he came in that night. He admitted immediately that his wife had been very upset. I phrased my next question this way: on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 is your wife telling you she ran into a friend at the supermarket, and 10 is her calling you in a panic to say that she's barricaded herself in a bedroom and 3 men are trying to get at her. On that scale of emotion, how would you describe her that night when you walked in? She was a good solid 8, he replied. She was definitely scared. He added that when he came up on the porch, she was already at the door, telling him of the strange flash over near the Davises, and the noise and the vibration, and her fear that there had been an earthquake. He tried to think of an explanation and suggested that perhaps a car had hit a utility pole and that was what had caused the lights to flicker and the house to shake. Bernie also told me that when he came home that night, a little after 11 p.m., all the digital clocks in the house were flashing and had to be reset. Something had definitely affected their power supply, at least momentarily. When one adds the Lloyd's account to the others, the meshing of time and incident becomes very significant. Now, any theory as to what happened that night must explain a number of anomalous incidents, from the physical effects in the Davis' yard and the electrical and other disturbances at the Lloyd's, to Kathie's inexplicable missing hour and the odd lights she and her mother saw earlier. The UFO abduction phenomenon, as I have pointed out, has very specific recurring features. In order to test the possibility that Kathie had been abducted that night, I tried to see if the evidence so far supported these known patterns. UFO abductions are most commonly reported to last between 1 and 2 hours. Note: though the vast majority, probably more than 90%, of all abductions last not more than 2 hours, there are a few dramatic exceptions. Travis Walton, for example, was missing for a 5-day period. C. Coral and Jim Lorenzen, abducted, New York, Berkeley, 1977, pages 80 to 113. Therefore, if Kathie was taken shortly after she went outside with her rifle, about 9:30 or 9:40 p.m., the abduction could easily have ended about an hour later at 10:45, and by that reckoning, the flash and sounds and strange electrical effects Joyce Lloyd reported at that time could have coincided with the UFO's departure. Another pattern in many UFO abductions demonstrates their selective nature. If particular individuals within a group are the targets, and they are, for example, riding in an automobile with others who are not desired, these others are often switched off, put in a state of suspended animation until the targeted individuals are returned. In the David Oldham case, an abduction I discussed in Missing Time, Oldham was riding in the back seat of a 2-door car. When the car was stopped and the abduction began, his 2 friends in the front were somehow switched off. Oldham pushed the seat and his companions forward and got out only with great difficulty. He walked on, compelled, as it were, towards a huge light, and later, after the abduction was over, struggled back into the rear seat past his suspended friends. By the time their animation returned, David's memories of his UFO experience had vanished and were not restored until he was hypnotically regressed years later. When Kathie and her mother heard Joyce Lloyd's bizarre account, they were both surprised by the fact that they heard or saw nothing unusual that night except the odd lights they had described earlier. But if Kathie had been abducted and her mother switched off, then it might follow that neither would have been consciously aware of the flash and sounds which Joyce described as having emanated from their backyard. The marks in that backyard were, of course, a crucial clue in the mystery. The grass in the circle and straight swath began to wither and die immediately after June 30th, and by July 4th, the pattern was dramatically visible. But the odd physical effects of the event were soon to multiply. The hedge in the immediate area of the bird feeder also began to wither, and ultimately, Robert Davis had to cut the plants back almost to the roots to force new growth. The degree of damage to portions of the hedge was in direct proportion to their proximity to the bird feeder. In the spring, the Davis family had planted a few tomato plants in the general vicinity of what became the burned circle. The fruit these plants eventually produced were abnormally large and so mealy as to be inedible. Kathie's eye problems and nausea were not the only symptoms of her experience that night. She began to suffer some degree of hair loss and felt generally unwell for days afterward. She was also troubled by a low-level pain in her right ear and slightly impaired hearing over the next few weeks. One can hypothesize that whatever affected the Davises' yard was the source of a powerful and destructive form of energy, a force strong enough to heat the ground so that it was still warm to the touch 45 minutes later when little Tammy walked across the baked area in her bare feet. The nausea and dizziness the three swimmers felt suggests the presence of some residual radiation-like effect, as does Kathie's later hair loss. The bizarre electrical effects that occurred in the Lloyd house give another dimension to the power of these emissions, an elusive mix, perhaps, of microwave and other forms of radiation. Shortly after I received Kathie's original September letter, I asked her to send me samples of the soil within the burned circle, as well as control samples from unaffected areas a few feet away. A few days later, I received them, neatly packed in plastic Ziploc bags. Kathie explained that the samples from within the burned area had not been easy to dig up. The ground inside the circle was so hard that she had to jump up and down on a spade to break into the compressed earth. The first thing I noticed was that the color of this sample was a light grayish brown, in contrast to the rich brown black of the soil from unaffected areas nearby. The texture is hard and dry, having more the appearance of gravel than a soft, pliable loam. The soil samples were taken in the middle of September, unfortunately more than 10 weeks after the incident, so several different possible testing avenues had been already somewhat compromised. Crystallographic and spectrographic analysis showed no apparent differences between the two samples. However, it was necessary to heat the unaffected sample in an oven at 800 degrees Fahrenheit for 6 hours to achieve the same color as that of the affected soil, though without duplicating its solidified appearance. Clearly, the amount of energy emitted by something in the Davises' backyard that night was enormous, though we have no idea of its nature. The later history of the baked circle and the straight swath is equally interesting because there was no grass at either spot. When the first winter snow came, it covered the bare ground evenly and made the pattern of the marks even clearer. And when the temperature rose above freezing and the snow began to melt, it melted first over the affected areas, again rendering the marks clearly visible. I photographed the area In late May of 1985, nearly 2 years after the original event, and the mass of the circle was still almost devoid of vegetation. Despite Robert Davis's attempt to plant new grass seed, I also noticed a general absence of insect life, ant hills, burrows, etc. Though the grass has begun to creep in from the perimeter of the circle, shrinking its circumference somewhat. One can speculate that if a UFO landed at this spot, then the long, bare path connected to the circle may indicate the direction of its takeoff, since it leads away from a tangle of overhanging tree branches and wires and towards the open sky. Here, the vegetation has grown in much more densely, though this pattern, too, is still clearly visible 2 years later. If a UFO landed and rested on the circular area for perhaps an hour and then took off across the straight swath, one can hypothesize that the straight swath would then have received a lower dosage of whatever radiation was present. One final point should be made about the baked area on the Davis' property. When Kathie first sent me the photographs of her backyard after the June 30th, 1983 incident, I asked her father about any underground pipes that might run through the area. The photograph of the 49-foot-long straight swath raised the possibility of some kind of leaking or recently laid pipeline, though clearly the ground had not been recently dug up. Its dead grass was of one continuous growth with the living grass next to it. Still, it was an issue that had to be explored. Robert Davis explained that 10 years previously, he had installed beneath the backyard a septic system consisting of a geometric pattern of drainage fingers extending out at right angles from a central line. These pipes were the only ones beneath the backyard, but the 49-foot swath of dead soil that appeared so suddenly and mysteriously ran at an angle to his system, crossing his drainage pipes at only 3 points, and thus eliminating any possible connection between the two lines. And as I know from my property on Cape Cod, septic systems encourage the growth of vegetation rather than inhibiting it, which invalidated any sewer pipe theory at the onset. In the words of Irma Bombeck, the grass is always greener over the septic tank. In October of 1983, Kathie came to New York, and we met for the first time. Our initial investigation focused on her dream experience of 1979 and a later similar encounter. Because Kathie's conscious recall of both incidents was clearly incomplete, we decided to employ hypnosis to aid her memory and to overcome any blocks that might be present. Dr. Aphrodite Clamar conducted the first 2 hypnotic sessions, and I took over for 2 more. These initial explorations will be covered in later chapters. Kathie proved to be a fine hypnotic subject, but it was not until my first trip to Indianapolis in January of 1984 that I suggested we try to regress her back to the night of June 30th, 1983, when the peculiar physical damage occurred on the Davis property. She had never been eager to talk about that event, and so was even less inclined to think about exploring it hypnotically. On my last night in Indianapolis, we drove to her friend Dee Ann's house, where I conducted an interview on the events of that evening. Dee Ann's account supported my growing suspicion that there was a period of time missing from Kathie's conscious recollections. We chatted about the strangeness of the entire sequence of events, and then Kathie suddenly said to me, "Why don't we do the hypnosis now? If we have to do it about that night, let's get it over with. And Deanne can see how nice hypnosis can be and how relaxing it is." Kathie has always been reluctant to undergo hypnosis in her own house, an interesting condition in itself. And so we began in the usual way. Kathie made herself comfortable on the couch, and I started the calming induction process, part of which involves picturing a placid, beautiful ocean beach. She had been through this process on 8 previous occasions, but in a moment she began to tremble. "I want to wake up," she said, her voice quietly urgent. "Wake me up now." I quickly counted backwards from 5 to 1, having given her the customary instructions, and at 1, her eyes opened and she sat up. It was obvious that she was extremely frightened. She told us that when she began to glide into a relaxed, familiar trance state, she suddenly saw herself standing at the window, looking out at the light in the pool house. "I just couldn't go on. My head would start to hurt, and I would think I can't go any further, or I'm going to die. My body felt like it was going to die. I don't even know what I was afraid of. I just felt like my body was going to die if I remembered any more. So I had to wake up." I felt Kathie's hands, and they were very cold. Her breathing was still agitated, but she was slowly regaining her composure. I said that her asking to be brought out of the trance demonstrated the control the subject has during the hypnotic process, and that should be a reassuring fact. I wanted to calm her any way I could, but it was not easy. She had had a real shock. "I never felt that kind of scared when I was with Dr. Clemar, or when we did it before. But this voice in my head kept telling me if I remember any more, I'm going to die. Feel your body. Feel it. You're going to die if you remember any more. Feel your head. It's going to burst. Your chest is going to cave in, and you're going to die if you remember any more." Something in my mind kept telling me this, and I started feeling really cold all over, like I was dead. I just wanted to wake up. It was bad. I just started to see myself standing in front of the window, looking at that funny light. I pointed out that we hadn't even completed the induction process when she began to react with great fear. I had not yet mentioned the night of June 30th or any other detail designed to lead her back to that experience. But I knew what we were headed back to. We'd just been talking about it with Deanne. It's been on my mind all day, but I've been too chicken about trying to go back to it. I didn't want to. Man, I really thought I was going to die. I asked her if the voice was her own, telling herself that she was going to die, or if the voice seemed external, another voice telling her this. It wasn't me. I'm telling myself relax and enjoy this feeling, and you're going to feel great when you wake up, and I'm listening to what you're saying, and I'm relaxing, and this other thought kept fighting its way in. But every time I tell myself, just relax, take a deep breath, and don't think about standing in front of the window. Just think about a beach and relax. I'd try to picture a beach and I'd see it, and then it would fade out. I'd be standing back in front of the window and I'd hear,
"You're going to die if you remember any more."
it was just like a voice bursting through. I'm scared. I tried as best I could to reassure her, to calm her fears, to explain that there seems to be no malice, no retribution present in this kind of UFO experience, despite the apparent threats. Nevertheless, there was obviously no choice but to put the June 30th, 1983 incident on the back burner, to be looked into at a later time. The full narrative of what happened to Kathie that night was not to emerge until my second visit to Indianapolis in November 1984. But in the meantime, she had several vivid and important memory flashbacks. Hypnosis often seems to open the gates of normal recollection. Frequently, after a regression session, the subject goes on to recall more and more pieces of the puzzle in separate, disconnected dreams and sudden flashes of memory. Shortly after her first abortive attempt at hypnotic recall, Kathie made a dramatic and spontaneous breakthrough. She recalled standing in the doorway of the garage and looking out into the yard at an egg-shaped craft supported on 4 jointed legs. She also recalled a ball of light less than 2 feet in diameter, seeming to move up and down her body, painfully irradiating her with light as she stood paralyzed and unable to respond. It was a particularly disturbing memory and an extremely vivid one. The quick sketch she made of the UFO, showing the part of it that was visible as she stood in the doorway, closely resembles the egg-shaped craft in a little-known South African abduction case of which I was at the time unaware. More importantly, the UFO, as she recalled it, was located exactly above the burned circle in her yard. When I returned to Indianapolis, I was eager to explore this June 30th incident, and on the 11th of November, the hypnotic session finally took place. I spent an extra amount of time inducing the trance, calming Kathie, reassuring her that it would be all right now to remember. We began with her mother's phone call to her at D. Ann's and her drive back home. She described coming into the house and deciding to take her father's rifle with her. I just felt real strange. Something wasn't right, and I want something to protect me. The hair on my arms was standing up on end, and I felt all tingly everywhere. What's happening, Kathie? I don't know. I just don't feel right. I went down the sidewalk and down the steps and across the yard. I got to the pool house and I reached out to open the latch, and it was real rusty and hard to open. It was stuck. But I got it open. I was afraid to open the door. I thought about my dog. I wondered where she was. I pulled the door open and stuck my gun in and hollered, "You've got 3 seconds to give it up," or something like that. I gave them 3 seconds and then reached in and turned on the light, and nobody was there. Everything looked fine, and I was relieved. Kathie now describes walking to the back of the property towards a large shed where she finds her dog Penny. At this point in her narrative, she shifts to the present tense, indicating a deepening of the trance state. She won't come with me. She's just going off. I still feel creepy, like somebody's watching me from the woods. But he won't fool me when he sees this gun. So glad I have it. I guess I'll go to the garage and look around. Kathie stirs and jumps slightly. Are you touching me? Somebody's touching my arm. I didn't touch you, Kathie. How does it feel? It feels like somebody's touching me lightly, although it's stopped now. Kathie describes heading towards the garage to look around. The garage is attached to the house, and the rear pedestrian door opens into the backyard. Something was touching my arm, and it felt like they were running their fingers on me. It didn't hurt. It was creepy, and it wouldn't stop. She resumes her narrative. I turn on the garage light and stick the gun in and holler the same thing. I have a gun, and you got 3 seconds, and then I go in, and it's quiet, and everything looks fine. I walk over and look behind the cabinet, and I look behind a stack of mattresses, and everything's okay. Now I'm starting to feel real strange. My head really hurts, and now I'm starting to feel real tingly and hot. I've got to get out of the garage. She tenses and stirs uneasily. What's happening, Kathie? I can't see. Everything's all white, very irritated. It's okay, Kathie. You're all right. Tell us what you're seeing and feeling. She's very agitated. My head hurts so much. I can't move. It feels like I can't see anything. Even when I shut my eyes, it's all white. I feel like I'm stinging. Like there's little things crawling all over my skin. I can't do anything about it. Where are you, Kathie? Are you by the garage? I don't know. I can't see. Now something's pinching my arm. The muscle. The same arm that was touched. Sighs deeply. I feel fine now. My ear hurts, and my arm feels like somebody's holding me, but I feel fine. Somebody's holding your arm? Do you feel fingers? No, just around my arm. I don't know, but my ear hurts. Are you still holding your gun? No, I'm not holding anything. I'm just standing. And there's something holding my arm, and it feels like somebody's poking my ear with a pencil or something. It feels like I've got an ear infection, and my ear hurts real bad. I want to keep moving my arm out to touch my ear, but someone's holding my arm, and I can't walk, and I still can't see because everything's all white, and my eyes are shut. I don't think I want to see. Calms her. Kathie, what did you see just before this happened? I saw the doorway. I guess I'm still in the garage standing in the doorway, looking out. I saw a round ball of white light looking right at me, and it's about the size of a little bigger than a basketball. At your head height? Yes, close. I'm right past the concrete. The concrete slab behind the garage is about 5 feet from the burned circle where the UFO apparently rests. I'm not scared. I feel better. Can you move in any way now? No, I'm just standing here, looking at the light, and it's looking at me. I guess it must have turned off 'cause I can see. Now it's going down towards the ground real slow. And now it's going back up again. And it stops where it was before. I don't know what to do. It isn't hurting me except for my ear. It's just sitting there. And I want to know what it is. Can you see anything else around there, in the yard? There's a lot of dark things in the yard. I can't really see what they are. They're just there. I think there's 6. 6 dark things. They're not very big, but I can't see what they are. I don't think I want to get any closer. They're kind of shaped like big bullets. I think they're just an outline. They're not moving. Kathie describes them as being about her height, smooth and featureless. Everything is still, and then she sighs deeply, nervously. What happened, Kathie? The things are starting to move. They're getting in line. They're coming towards me, but not directly at me. Now they're gone, except the one. How close were you from the line? 2! I hear my name. It said...
Kathie!
Something touched me. It reached and touched me. But I didn't think it was close. I didn't think it was close enough to touch me. On my neck. It made me cringe. I'm tired. The bullet thing's gone. There's just the light now. I can't see. I feel like it's going all through my body. Once more, I calmed her, and after a moment it became clear that the episode had ended and Kathie was no longer remembering what had happened near the landed craft. Her next remark was in a normal voice as she resumed her previous conscious recollection. I think instead of sewing, I'll go swimming. I asked where her gun is now. It's on the floor, in the garage. I guess I dropped it. I turned around to shut the light and I saw it there on the floor, near the doorway. I asked her how she feels at this point. Funny, sick to the stomach, and my ear hurts. I can hardly hear out of it. I asked where her mother was when she went into the house. She's standing in the doorway, looking out the screen door. She looks all pale and sleepy. I told her everything was all right, but I guess it wasn't all right, and I guess she already knew that if she was standing in the doorway. But I don't know. I just don't want to think. I don't want to sew. I don't want to think. My head hurts. I calmed her and then brought her out of the trance. Watching Kathie relive that night had been grueling for me, so I knew how profoundly upsetting it must have been for her. The general tenor of the experience had been physical. The disturbing touches at her arm, the painful intrusion in her ear, the blinding light that moved up and down her body, apparently causing the tingling and the heat. There were more specifically physical recollections than visual ones, though Kathie told me afterwards that she had seen dimly the egg-shaped UFO to her left as she stood in the garage doorway. I knew it was there, but I didn't want to look at it. I was more worried about the dark things, and whenever I could see anything, I tried to keep my eye on them. Her account differed in several important ways from the standard abduction report. First, she did not describe the usual short, gray-skinned UFO occupant type, though her recollections did suggest a humanoid presence holding her arm and inserting the pencil-like object in her ear. The touch, she said, was gentle, like a person would touch you. The odd, bullet-shaped things that formed a line and approached her rather indirectly seemed more robot-like in her description than humanoid. She told me later that they moved as if they sensed her fear and were acting somehow to avoid frightening her more deeply. But that, of course, is an admittedly subjective reading of the situation. Much of the time, Kathie could not see because of the extreme light that flooded her. She said that it was as if she herself were lit up internally, glowing with as much intensity as the white balls of light. She described the initial shock and pain as being like a bolt of lightning hitting the center of her chest and then flowing all through her body. She does not specifically recall being inside the craft, stretched out on an examining table, though her recollections do not rule out this possibility. These peculiar globes of light, somewhat larger than basketballs, seemed to be all over the Davises' acreage that night, and Kathie recalled that they appeared to be attached to the UFO's outer structure, but were able to move independently away as if they would become separate, exploring devices. One can theorize, then, that the UFO landed, dark and unlit, beneath the trees on the Davises' property before Kathie left to drive to her friend's house. What she saw, glowing from inside the pool shed, was one of these globes of white light, and later her mother saw a second globe illuminating the bird feeder. When Kathie returned and went outside to look for intruders, she herself became the object of the white light's attention. The UFO literature is full of case reports in which white lights are described as moving back and forth above the abductees' bodies, presumably scanning or examining them. To use a handy anthropomorphic image. But unfortunately, as with most of the large questions about the UFO phenomenon, we simply don't know what these lights are or why they do what they do. In this particular instance, however, it may be significant that the maximum blinding irradiation came at the outset of Kathie's experience and then again at its very end. More immediately interesting to me was Kathie's account of the insertion of a pencil-like object into her ear and her subsequent discomfort and hearing deficiency. Of the 58 people I've worked with who have recalled nearly complete abduction experiences, 11 have reported the insertion of what seems to be tiny implants into their bodies. 6 have recalled a thin probe of some sort with a tiny ball on the end having been inserted in a nostril, and they feel pain when the probe apparently breaks through at the top of the nasal cavity. 2 reported the same type of probe entering the region of the eye socket, and 3 recall the probes going in, through, or behind the ear. Specific hypothetical reasons for these probable implants, as well as the medical evidence for their existence, will be gone until later. It is necessary now only to point out that in every case the destination of the probe lies in the region of the brain. As I have said before, UFO abduction accounts must be taken seriously because of the repetitive pattern of details described in widely separate cases. In November of 1984, I knew of only one ear implant case, Kathie's, but 3 months later, I had become involved with a second. In February of 1985, I was contacted through a radio call-in program I was appearing on in the Miami, Florida area by a woman I shall call Sandy Thomas. Sandy Thomas would not speak on the air. She simply left her phone number with the station and asked to be called back. She had been too upset, she told me later, to try to talk during the broadcast. She wanted to report a dream she had had recently on December 28th, 1983, to be exact, which she felt had been almost too real to have been literally a dream. The essence of her recollection was that she had been awakened in the night, paralyzed, and then taken from her house by 3 shadowy, large-headed figures. She was transported to some sort of circular room, placed on a table, and a thin tube of some sort had then been inserted in her left ear. There's much more detail to her story, but she remembered being taken back to her home and placed in her bed, where she awoke in great fear, feeling quite ill. "I must have perspired a lot, too," she said to me later, "because my hair and neck were all wet. Even the pillow was wet." She immediately roused her husband and told him in detail what she remembered of the experience. She said that though she was feeling physically ill, she was still so frightened that she insisted he stand guard while she went to the bathroom. As I questioned her further about her recollections, it became clear to me that she had not called the radio station merely to report a nightmare. Though she did not say so, it was obvious that she felt this was something more than a typical bad dream. A number of things she and her husband told me during several phone calls led me to believe that there might well be other similar experiences in her family. And so, since I was going to be in their vicinity for a few days, I decided to interview them in person. The Thomases live in a sunny, modest bungalow near St. Augustine with their 10-year-old son and a number of pets. Sandy was at first quite nervous about trying hypnosis as an aid to recollection, but ultimately she decided that it was better to explore her situation than to continue in fear and doubt, not knowing if she had been dreaming or if she really had been taken from her bedroom that night. I assured her that there was no way I could clarify the issue for her, but that by reliving her experience through hypnosis, she would more easily be able to answer the question for herself. Her recollections in the trance state followed the dream very closely, but with a great deal more vividness and detail. I will present here just a section of the transcript dealing with the apparent ear implant. Sandy has been taken into a large round room and is lying on a flat table. Her fear has lessened at this point. It had been intense at the beginning of her account, and she states that one of the men tells her she is going to go to sleep for a while. "I'm feeling angry." "Why?" "Because I'm here. I didn't want to be." "They said that you are going to go to sleep for a little bit. Is that right?" "Yes, and I'm glad. I would rather be asleep." "He's going to put some water in my ear." "What's the water in?" "It's not a needle. It's like a tube. I just want to go to sleep real fast." "How do you feel?" "Awful, just limp and awful, and this tube is sticking my ear. My neck's turned." "Is this tube a thick tube or a thin tube? Let's start with the idea of a pencil's thickness. Is it bigger than that or littler or what?" "Smaller, and now it's out." "How did it get out?" "The tall man took it out, and my hair's wet. Now there's a small tiny one, like a light. There's a light." "Do you mean a small tiny tube?" "Yes, very small, with a tiny light on it. It lights on the end. And it's in my ear, and they make me move my jaw." "That's it." "That's it. Did they say that's it?" "That's what they said."
That's it. That's not so bad.
"Now they want to see if I can walk. They're so stupid. They make the table go down to maybe the height of a chair, and I'm supposed to get off and just walk? But I'm cold again and scared, and my hair's wet against my neck, and it feels awful." "Does your ear hurt, Sandy?" A leading question on my part, which makes the wording of her answer all the more interesting. "I have an itching between my ear and my throat. Is it on the skin or inside the skin, or where is it? I guess it's inside. It feels like something when you get a tickle and you can't reach it. Many more things surfaced during the long hypnotic session, and when I brought Sandy out of the trance state, she was extremely upset. She cried on her husband's shoulder, and a few minutes later, I tried to comfort her too. But it was clear to me that she did not want to admit to herself that these recollections were something more than a mere bad dream. There was evidence to support the physical reality of her account. Something had wet her hair and neck, a condition her husband had also observed that night. The Thomases and I knew that perspiration that heavy and that localized, she had been dry everywhere except that one place, was an unacceptable explanation. Sandy told me, and her husband concurred, that she complained for several days afterwards of an unsettling itch in her left ear, and that when he looked into it, it appeared to be red and irritated. But there was one last emotional moment before I left. Sandy and I sat at her kitchen table while she worked on a sketch of the gray-skinned, large-eyed figures she recalled from her dream. When she was finished, I did something I immediately regretted. From the material I had brought with me, I handed Sandy a page of drawings of very similar UFO occupants made by witnesses in other UFO abduction cases. She glanced at these sketches for what seemed to be only a split second. Then she burst into tears, jumped up, and rushed out of the room. It was as if she were a rape victim who had been shown mugshots of her tormentors. The main resemblance between Sandy's and Kathie's abduction accounts is, of course, the similarly described ear penetration. But there are other parallels, too. Each reported feeling nauseated after the experience, and each endured several days of discomfort in the area near the affected ear. As the reader will learn, there are still other, more profound resemblances. Both women have young sons who also seem to have suffered UFO abductions, and like Kathie, Sandy had apparently been abducted at least twice before her December 1984 experience. Most disturbing of all, there's evidence that Sandy and Kathie have been similarly utilized in some sort of genetic experiment, a subject we will explore in later chapters. Because of the relatively large tracts of land in the Copley Woods and an ingrown habit of respecting one another's privacy, the Davises are not on intimate terms with their neighbors. Therefore, when I visited Kathie and her family, I made it a point to ask anyone close by if they had seen or heard anything unusual on that June night in 1983. The people living to the south of the Davises were away on vacation at that time, so they had nothing to report. But a very interesting incident occurred to the neighbor who lives directly across the street to the west of their home. The problem with her account is that the witness is unsure of its date. Despite its fascinating details, we cannot with any certainty connect it to Kathie Davis's June 30th abduction. Sometime in the summer of 1983, this neighbor, Martha Elkins, was awakened by a loud roaring sound that made her house vibrate and so terrified her that she felt sure a jet plane was about to crash into her home. Martha leaped out of bed and ran to the window. A nearby nightlight flickered and her digital clock began to flash, indicating an interruption in its power supply. Though she could see nothing, Martha assumed that a crash was imminent. Oddly, the roaring and the vibration continued, seeming to remain in more or less the same place rather than passing quickly overhead. After a few moments, the source of the sound apparently changed direction, moving slowly away on a more northerly course, and shortly thereafter, it was gone. Martha said that the 3 digital clocks on the same side of the house as her bedroom were flashing and had to be reset, though the digital clocks in her kitchen, living room, and guest room, the opposite side of the house, were unaffected. The home of her closest neighbors was near that unaffected side, and when Martha asked them the next day what they had seen or heard, they had absolutely nothing to report. They had not awakened and had no temporary power outage in any part of their house. I interviewed them later, and all 3 family members confirmed this apparent absence of effect, a situation Martha finds almost impossible to believe. She said to me that she had never felt so close to death. The roaring was so intense and the vibration so frightening as her lights flickered and flashed that she finds it inconceivable that the entire neighborhood wasn't awake and terrified. Joyce Lloyd, who can date her similar account to the night of June 30th, and who thought the surrounding area was undergoing an earthquake, was also amazed that no one else seemed to have reported these effects. One is led to speculate, based on the apparently narrow zone of electrical interference, that the sounds and vibrations were also strictly localized. How that idea can be squared with our present knowledge of physics is only one more UFO mystery. The June 30th, 1983 Kathie Davis case must be seen as one of the most important abduction accounts in the UFO literature, for a very compelling reason. The physical evidence in this case, such as the landing trace marks on the Davis property, is so very extensive, more so than in any UFO abduction report I know. Not only Kathie, the principal figure in this encounter, but her friend Deanne and Deanne's daughter Tammy all suffered similar physical after effects, presumably because they were near the landing site only minutes after the UFO departure. Kathie's account of undergoing an ear operation during her abduction, a procedure previously unknown to me, received support a few months later when Sandy Thomas in Florida described virtually the same experience and the same physical after effects. The electrical interference, the vibration and sounds described by the Lloyds and their neighbor, if in fact the 2 events occurred the same night, provide even more data for analysis. The June 30th landing is surely the most visible event so far in the ongoing Copley Woods saga. It is not, however, the most significant or portentous, as the reader will soon learn.